Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to this talk hosted by the Center for Psychedelic Psychotherapy and Trauma Research. It is an honor to introduce Dr. James Spademan. Dr. Fadiman received his BA degree from Harvard University in 1960 and a master's degree and a doctorate in psychology from Stanford University in 1965. He is acknowledged for his research on microdosing psychedelics and is known as the father of microdosing for his pioneering explorations and studies on the subject. He co-founded the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, now known as Sophia University, where he lectured on psychedelic studies. Since 2010, he has been collecting reports from thousands of people who have tried microdosing. Many of them followed his suggested usage routine, coined the Fadiman protocol. In 2011, Fadiman published his book, The Psychedelic Explorer Guide, Safe, Therapeutic, and Sacred Journey. In this discussion, he will share his expertise on the subject. First, Dr. Fadiman will engage in a discussion with our very own Lauren Leapow and Dr. Rachel Yehuda, and then we will open up for questions. Please put all your questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the discussion. And now I'm pleased to present Dr. Yehuda and James Fadiman.
Thank you very much. Good
Great.
morning.
Hi, James. It's great to have you here. And Dr. Fadiman, I should say, and Dr. Leapow. We're going to talk about a great topic today, microdosing of psychedelics. And this is a topic that we haven't yet covered in our mindset lectures. But I can tell you that by far it is the most asked questions of any of our speakers. People seem to be just fascinated about this idea of what is microdosing, does it work, should I be prescribing this to patients when it becomes legal, where can I find literature on it? And the one or two papers in the literature do not seem to support that this is a good idea. But you really are the expert in this topic. So I'm going to turn it over to you to just help us shed some light on this deep mystery called microdosing of psychedelics.
Yep. All right. Well, it's actually not quite as mysterious as you made it sound, but there is probably, one can guess if it is as popular as it seems to be, people may feel it's popular because it's beneficial. But let's start with basics, which is what is microdosing? And microdosing, kind of a definition that I wrote yesterday, is microdosing is small doses of psychedelics taken intermittently for healing mental or physical conditions or enhanced wellness. Now, I kind of like that, but then I looked up one of the major sources of information, which is a subreddit on Reddit called Microdosing, and I like their definition better. Microdosing involves taking a minuscule dose of a psychedelic substance, usually 5 to 10% of a regular dose, with the intention of increasing the quality of your life. I think it's a better definition because increasing the quality of your life doesn't divide it into you have to be sick in order to get better, or that you're okay and that being better than okay falls outside the realm of medicine, which is kind of crazy.
Dr. Fadiman, before you continue, these are great definitions. This is a great time to remind any of our listeners that whether it's a macrodose or a microdose, the use of psychedelics is still illegal, still scheduled in a Schedule 1, and a microdose doesn't make it legal. But there was a time before the scheduling, and of course we know that people do a lot of experimenting anyhow, but I just think that I want to make sure that no one gets the idea that microdosing is a way to just get around the prohibition against macrodosing, and then just allow you to continue following that caveat.
Now, that caveat has not been hasn't been followed very well by the American people, as we call them. Since psychedelics were made Schedule 1, and unavailable through all legal channels, and this is US government figures, between 36 and 38 million Americans have taken a major psychedelic. And that figure goes up every year, regardless of what the laws are or what the publicity is, about 600,000 a year. So, and if we look at that group of 36 million people, and we kind of education level, most of those people are in the top 50% in terms of education. So it's very rare that I have come to an audience that is not sprinkled with people who have personal experience. So yes, and yes, it is illegal, but that has only created a massive illegal marketplace. And as Michael Pollan pointed out, there are hundreds of guides, meaning people who help people with high dose psychedelics. And that's the way it is. There are countries where the law is a little more based on medical evidence, but we're not one of them yet. So that's the important part of the caveat is you should always be told at the beginning of a lecture about something that people are using that is not yet legal, that it's not yet legal. The question of whether it is dangerous or helpful is another level of question. And we're probably going to get to the question that Rachel mentioned about the literature is not enthusiastic, or at least a few studies. And so I'm going to give you the kind of information that I've been working with over the last 10 years, which keeps my interest up. This came in literally yesterday from a coach. There are now microdose coaches, okay? I'll just give you, this is a very brief report. Showers felt so hard. Cooking felt hard. Taking the dog outside felt hard. I can now do these things with no problem. I even cleaned my whole place this weekend. I had an exceptionally stressful few weeks at work, and I dove in head first instead of hiding in bed with French fries crying. I have a vision for my future, and 2 months ago, didn't even want to live into that future. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of taking in individual reports from around the world. And one of our earlier studies was about 1,500 people, but from 51 countries. So this is not an unknown phenomena in most parts of the world. So that's a kind of basic hello.
Yeah, that's a very, very good hello. But according to what I have read in the literature, the problem isn't that that people don't feel better on the microdose. It's that they felt better also on the placebo. So can you walk us through really how that would work, that a microdose would be beneficial to someone, and would it be different than a macrodose? Like, what are the mechanics of it? And just explain it to us, because microdosing isn't so much of a concept in psychiatry, and a lot of people might not be familiar with what it is.
Well, microdosing is, again, taking a very small amount, and the term intermittently, which is it's not, macrodose is once or twice with a massive amount of support staff. Microdosing is taking something very simply at home every few days, the way one would have literally a cup of tea or a thyroid pill. It doesn't disrupt your day. It doesn't change your basic behavior. People do report that they function better, as this person described. In this case, we're obviously dealing with someone who's been seriously depressed, and for reasons that we have not yet put too much into the literature, we don't know quite why, but we do know that it happens. So some of the studies that have managed to find no effect from a microdose have had, first of all, they're double-blind studies, and second of all, the blind was broken with most of the studies. It's fairly similar, about 74% of the time. So as someone who has not a great love for double blind studies, but a fair knowledge of them, that's not very good. But let's assume that the double blind is adequate. People have found is that expecting something to go well improves your chances of it going well. Expectation is built into everything you do. If you think about it, when you're going to go to a restaurant, you have high expectations that it's going to be a positive event. When you're visiting someone, you have an expectation that it'll be a positive or maybe a negative event, but you have expectations. And it's, I don't know of any study that has managed to tell the people involved, don't have any expectations. We're going to try and take that variable away. So the other thing is, if you start, imagine we're dealing with the question of, does it improve emotional lability? Does it make you less depressed? Okay. And we have a group of people, and this is from one of the studies, all of whom have already microdosed and have almost no pathology. These are healthy, young people. The problem in measuring is there isn't much left in, say, the depression scale. And I'm thinking of an early study we did, and my colleague Sophia Korb said, you know, what's fascinating is the most depressed people have made the most improvement. And I got very excited, because imagine something which affects the most ill most strongly. That's terrific. And then she said, however, if we really look at it, the problem is that on the scale, if you go from 8 to 6, that's a huge jump, but you can't go from, if you go from 3 to 1, that's half as much. So understand and understand that the researchers now are saying, and I'm quoting from a recent study that showed very little effect in Europe. They said we need to have a sample which has sufficient affective or depressive symptoms before we can actually measure their effects. Okay? You know, if you're seeing a patient and you have a something that'll control their blood sugar, and you measure their blood sugar and it's fine. Measuring their blood, giving them that medication will show that that medication has almost no effect. Okay? So that's a problem in the literature. And what's to me kind of exciting is some of the researchers are saying, given the thousands and thousands of people who say it's helpful, and given that my sample didn't show that it was helpful, instead of assuming that my sample, for some surprising reason, has finally uncovered the fraud of all these hundreds of thousands of people who have written their reports for just because they were asked to, or there's something in the way my study is designed which doesn't show the effect. Okay, so let's just leave it at that for now, because if you look at, for instance, the largest survey study, a very interesting one in Nature, 8,000 subjects, 4,000 microdosing, 4,000 not microdosing. And if you look at the demographics of the sample, very, very little difference. And each one took a whole battery of both psychological instruments and physiological instruments. And it turns out, not surprisingly, that the 4,000 people who were on microdosing improved more on a number of the variables than the people who were matched originally, but didn't microdose. So that's the kind of simplistic overview. And the other question is, do we accept the report of the people who give us reports, or do we decide that those reports are somehow not as useful as a statistical analysis done in a laboratory with not only a tightly controlled study, but a very tightly controlled sample? And what I'm seeing more and more is the problem in psychedelic studies is that the samples are beginning to differ from the population. And this is a quote from one of the researchers in Canada doing, I believe, a depression study. And she said, the problem is that the people I'm seeing in the study don't look like anyone that I see in the clinic. And I said, what do you mean? She said, the people in the clinic, of course, have multiple problems, multiple diagnoses. The people I see in the study have been kind of filtered out, so all they have is depression. And she says that just isn't real life. So that's a problem for the nature of the research. So I'm much more aware of what is called, now it's a technical term in the literature, real world evidence. It's called the final test for the pharmaceutical industry. Final test of a pharmaceutical, after all, is not how well it does to pass the FDA, but how well it works when someone in an office hands a bottle to a patient, and how that patient then comes back in several weeks and reports. So we're starting, curiously, because of the legal problems, we're starting with a massive amount of real world evidence, and we're now slowly getting back to verifying or not verifying that evidence in laboratory settings. Does that
Mm-hmm.
That's a different way of approaching it. And in the long run, if you're a researcher, you may never actually deal with patients. You may only deal with aggregates, with statistical groupings. But as physicians, the only people you're going to deal with are individuals one by one. And what you want to know is, will this help an individual? And if all it does, and I'll give you a quote here, this is from an early report, I don't care if it's a placebo, I haven't felt this good in 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's a different way of looking at evidence. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Also, Rachel, Dr. Yahuda just texted me that I think her signal dropped, so she's going to be off for a while. But I'm so curious along the same lines. And we actually just had someone send a chat to the panelists saying that they had participated in one of these trials, and then when they unblinded themselves, realized that they had not been able to guess, and they had been taking placebo, and they were so surprised. But maybe it doesn't matter. And so I'm curious, do you, and you were describing too, this example of like someone comes to the clinic and the prescriber, the physician is, prescribing this thing, and that's what matters. That's what actually happens. And there's so much around that. There's the care from the provider, and there's the clinic and all this transference. And I'm wondering how important you think it is that we really do differentiate any placebo effect or extra pharmacologic effects like from the effect of the substance itself. Is that a worthwhile project?
Well, let me give you a better definition. The word placebo is kind of a negative word that because researchers don't like it and pharmaceutical companies hate it. Okay. It really means natural healing response. That's what it means. It means your abilities, capacity to correct imbalances. And it's what every physician lives for. If you don't have the patient trying to get their system trying to get better, we know it's very difficult. So as someone said, I don't care if it's a placebo, I haven't felt this good. What they're saying is that what it may just do, and this may be a great placebo facilitator. All it may do is improve your ability to heal yourself. Now, that cuts across a whole lot of medical specialties, and I may, if you ask, give you a list of the kinds of changes that people have reported. Now, when I say people have reported, that's all. I have only, I'm a reporter. I kind of sit in my little office here, and people write me from all over the world about what they're experiencing. Now, we also have studies. And the study that Sophia and I did, we said, if you write us, we'll give you we'll answer your basic questions. How often should you take it? What's the size of the dose? And what are some of the conditions which would preclude your taking it? In return, we're asking you to fill out a little form every day for 30 days, the PANAS, positive and negative affective scores, which is how are you feeling up, how are you feeling down? And then at the end of the month, write us a report. and at the end of the month, determine what's the correct dosage for you, because you now know more about your body than we do. So that was our first, say, 1,500 people. So we learned a great deal by asking people. So we have the only survey that I know where we start with people that hadn't microdosed, and at the end of it, we have people who have microdosed and some drop off. And we don't know necessarily they dropped off either because they, for most cases, when we tracked them, they said didn't seem to have any effect. And others say it had some problem, headaches or nausea or something. However, again, real world evidence is interesting. We had a case, he wrote in, he said, I have a terrible set of symptoms. And he did, headaches and nausea and pain. And I wrote and said, this is all email, stop taking it. He said, no, you can't make me. And I said, no, I have to ask you to not take it anymore because it's causing you problems. And he said, you have, this is my decision. And what do you do when people are using an illegal substance in some country? So I waited, and a few days later, I got back a note. He said, I cut the dose in half and all my symptoms went away. So that's a piece of evidence that's a hard study to do, right? But it's a fascinating report. And if you look at the Global Drug Survey, which asks people all over the world about all the drugs you can think of, they've been following microdosing for 4 years. They had a certain sample of people microdosing, and they had a sample of people who'd stopped. And they'd stopped for either no effect or too much effect or taking it too often. Now, too much effect and taking it too often is simply they didn't have correct information. They didn't have dosing information. So we're looking at a phenomena that research is beginning to catch up on.
So true. Thank you. That makes sense. I think you had kind of alluded to this too. So I am wondering, are there people in general you advise should not do this? And is that anecdotal? Have you seen anything scary or dangerous or bad happen?
Okay. Now, remember, anecdotal is you ask people or they tell you.
That's true.
And if you think about it, if I'm doing a depression study and I'm using macrodoses and I'm doing that whole enormous bit of work, and at the end of a couple of months, what do I do with the patient? Do I say, don't tell me anything, I'm only going to measure your blood? We say, no, we say, how are you? And he says, I feel so much better. We make a note of that. Okay, that's not, when I, the physician or researcher, ask you and you answer me, that's not an anecdote. But if someone writes me an email or answers an email that I write, is that an anecdote? So be very careful between anecdote and just information. Okay. Now, having done my little righteous dance on that, get me back to the question. Okay. Who shouldn't take it?
Right. Yeah. And what sort of, what have you seen that maybe hasn't gone so well? That was surprising?
The report that we get most often is that we recommend people be careful. If your only symptom is anxiety, many people report either an increase in anxiety or an increase in awareness of anxiety. Again, since we don't know how to measure anxiety except by asking people, we can't distinguish that. So we don't recommend it for people who only have anxiety. There's a very wonderful subgroup, and any of you who are really geeky, this is a great bit of research. People with blue-green color blindness report after microdosing that they have what are called tracers, which is when you see a light source and you move your eye away, you get a little track of light. And they say it's really irritating to be at work and all the lights in your office are in motion, so to speak. And so we recommend people not do that. And after we recommended that people not do that on our website, microdosingpsychedelics.com, we got a few reports that said, yeah, you have tracers, but the improvements are worth it. We had a case where someone was on lithium carbonate, very, very strong drug, as you know. And they had a bunch of terrible symptoms, and we asked them to stop, and they did. And we decided that that was very much worth a serious warning. And since then, we've had a couple of lithium carbonate people that say, no, it wasn't a problem for them. So we know for some people on lithium carbonate, it's a bad idea. And in general, we recommend lithium. If you're on lithium carbonate, you're already in serious medical psychiatric condition, and we recommend that you don't microdose. Most recent, and I think perhaps the most kind of normal common concern, is tinnitus. Tinnitus is the ringing in your ears. And what we found, this is work out of the Microdosing Institute in the Netherlands, which has a database of over 4,000 people. And what they have reported recently is people microdosing, some, who report tinnitus. Now there's two groups. The tinnitus, people without tinnitus who get tinnitus, when they stop microdosing, the tinnitus goes away. The other group is they have tinnitus, and in microdosing, it gets worse. Okay? And I'm following at the moment someone in Australia with exactly that problem. And he wrote and said, is there any other substance I can take other than mushrooms, and will it make a difference? And the answer is, we don't know. But if you try another substance like LSD, which we know has way, 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 way less physiological correlates, it might help. And so far, what we've learned is when people stop microdosing, their tinnitus goes away, and we hope in your case it goes down. So that's probably the most serious concern we've had. As for the other question, and it's one that you may not get to, is what about people with serious mental illnesses who are absolutely unwelcome in any of the trials, microdose or macrodose? People who are bipolar, etc. Okay. Well, when you're sitting as I am and just getting people's information, of course, people with very severe mental illnesses have tried microdosing. And when I had a question some years ago about bipolar, I did what any normal researcher these days would do, is I went to Facebook, and I found the group of people who are bipolar who talk to each other. And I said to the moderator, can I ask your group, do they have any experience with psychedelics? And he said, sure. And what I got from the 8 or 10 reports was, definitely do not use high-dose psychedelics in your manic phase. You're already manic. And a stimulant will not be a good idea. And a lot of them said it's very helpful in your depressive phase, in that it alleviates a lot of the depressive symptoms that you go through. So that's data that we only have from real world experience, and that we've deliberately excluded from all of our studies for correct reasons. By the way, the correct reasons are that researchers don't want to have to deal with that someone goes seriously crazy 6 months after the study is over and blames the study. Because I did ask at some point several of my senior research friends, I know we exclude all these various mental illnesses from psychedelic research. Is there any data? And what I got back was a number of studies, all of which basically said, no, we don't have any data. We just think it's probably a good idea. So let us not deny kind of clinical sensitivity even when designing research. So those are some of the negatives. And again, what I found in every case is if people don't either benefit or feel it's uncomfortable, and people also, by the way, get a little bit of nausea, particularly if they're using psilocybin containing mushrooms, you stop. You know, it's again, if you have 10 friends and they all say, fantastic restaurant, new restaurant, you gotta go, and you go, and your meal is not good, you're not going to go back over and over to prove that it's not good. You stop, so that you don't have as much evidence about that restaurant from your experience as your friends do who've been a number of times. So kind of fairly wobbly, out of the way with a few loop answers, but there you go.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. You also kind of mentioned briefly something about maybe this person who is communicating with you to switch from psilocybin to LSD or something else. And so I'm curious about some of the differences. I think in February in neuropsychopharmacology, there was a paper saying like the subjective effects maybe of LSD and psilocybin aren't too different. It's more dose dependent, not substance dependent. But I feel like there's so much to learn there. We don't know or know how to measure it, how to go about even quantifying that or qualifying that. Have you seen in your experience that there is a difference between the substances?
Well, this is what I love about science is it eventually catches up with citizen science and real world evidence. The question is, and it's always been a good question, is what's the difference between psychedelics, between LSD and psilocybin? There were two studies, actually, one of which you read, one which was all physiological measures. The other was all emotional, social, consciousness measures. Both of them came up with the same conclusion that there is no difference between LSD, again, measuring doses, and psilocybin, except in the duration of effect. So we have it from hard science physiologically and hard science psychologically that there's no difference. Now, if we go to the citizen science world, where you get people who do things you wouldn't dare do in any research, a year or so ago, a young man in Los Angeles said, well, among my friends who've been using for a few years, we think that psilocybin is nicer, that it's warmer, that if you have concerns that have emotional connotations, that psilocybin is probably more helpful and more insightful. That if you're looking at problem solving and coding and technical issues and things that demand logic, LSD is colder and more analytic. This is at the microdose level. And I thought, that's what we're being told. So we have the hard science that they can't measure any differences. We have people's opinions and we can't measure those. But in any case, what we knew in the 1960s was that the only difference between LSD and psilocybin was duration of effect. So we have now validated folklore or 1960s research without controls and so forth. So that's the way it is. The difference, of course, is that psilocybin containing mushrooms are much more available and are, you're unlikely to get something that you didn't, it's a real thing. If you get something on blotter that somebody sells you, it may or may not have LSD in it. It may have something dangerous in it. There are a couple of substances at the microgram level which are terrible for you, which are sold. But that's a different set of issues. So the question is, LSD, psilocybin seem to operate in the same way. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. Kind of makes me think of this other question too, of combining medications or maybe combining psychedelics or the interactions of psychedelics with other medications that people might be on for other reasons. Have you encountered any people having difficulty with those sorts of interactions and getting into medical problems?
In the literature, and it's correct, ayahuasca, which has a massive physical effect, should not be taken by people who are on SSRIs. The interaction is a serious problem. When you get to the question of microdosing, and again, understand, I'm not doing research, I'm listening to research. We on the most answered, most questions that people ask these days, can I use a microdose with, and then fill in medication, herbal supplements, neurotropics, all kinds of strange things. On our site, we have a list of 180 items, pharmaceuticals, etc., that people have said they microdose successfully with those substances. So they don't seem to interact with many substances. And these are all the major pharmaceuticals, psychopharmaceuticals that you know of, and a few you don't. That's one kind of answer. The other, and it's a whole category of use, is people who are trying to get off of pharmaceuticals that either no longer help or the side effects are by now worse than the effects. And this is curiously both SSRIs, depressives, and Adderall, Provigil, and the other derivatives. They're all derivatives from methamphetamine. Get off of each of those. As you should know, the stimulants are addictive. And Adderall, by the way, is the third most used substance of college students, cannabis and alcohol being 1 and 2. And people are finding that using a microdose, whether it's true or not, they find it useful. It helps them get to taper off the pharmaceuticals that no longer help. I'm thinking in particular, personal friend was a student of mine a long time ago. He was on 2 antidepressants, and he said, was it possible that microdosing could help? I said, go to your physician and indicate that you'd like to taper off and that you're trying something else. And his physician said, well, let me switch you on one of your meds to one that is easier to get off of. I mean, he knew that what he was on was just more addictive. Okay. It took him a number of months, one pharmaceutical at a time. And after 6 months, he said, I'm back. I have my feelings back. I haven't had a full card of feelings in 30 years. And then he went into some detail. So they have a definite interactive effect with pharmaceuticals, but one is to improve the overall system so that the pharmaceutical can be down in dose or eliminated.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess it's sort of making me wonder too, because right now there's such a focus right now in this modern wave of psychedelic research and in culture, focusing on these trips and macrodoses and what you learn about yourself and how the healing process unfolds. And so I'm wondering, because I think you also started, when you first started getting interested in psychedelics,
Totally.
You started that way too, more interested in those kind of big trips. And personally, how did you start to become more interested in microdoses? And do you miss the kind of thinking on a daily basis more about like the transpersonal aspects? Is that still relevant? Sorry, I'm just throwing questions at you.
None of those sensible, realistic, normal behaviors. No, I was totally interested in high doses and in high doses, not heroic doses, but enough for individual transcendence, for loss of ego identity. And that was all that interested me. The whole idea of using it in a kind of psychotherapy where you talk to people and so forth, no interest. But the universe or the divine or whatever we call it said, how about you look at the least interesting possible psychedelic, which is microdosing? And a friend of mine, Robert Fort, said that Albert Hofmann microdosed. Albert Hofmann, who synthesized LSD and also first synthesized psilocybin, in his later years, and he lived to be 102, would take a microdose, turns out a little higher than a microdose. And he said it's very useful if you want to think about things and walk in the woods. He also, in 2006, recommended to Rick Dobbin in another famous interview that was published that he should look at these very low doses. And if you read the transcript, Rick Dobbin basically says, why would one have any interest in that? And Albert says, it's good for ideas, you should try it. And he didn't. So, 8 years later, I did. And again, I got interested because my feeling was that this would be pointless, because you didn't have the heavens didn't open up, the angels didn't talk to you, your great grandfather didn't tell you that you needed to forgive people, anaconda snakes didn't devour you, none of that fascinating stuff. Microdoses are exquisitely, when done correctly, uninteresting. There's a book out called A Really Good Day, and it's a woman, middle-aged woman in Berkeley, an attorney and novelist who microdoses, and she had started from being suicidal and on massive amounts of medications. And what she said, now and then she would realize, I'm having a good day. And at one point, she was making breakfast for her kids before they go to school, and she was in a nice mood. And she reflects in her notes that she's never in a nice mood when making breakfast for the kids. It's a horrible time of day. But she's in a good mood, and one of her children looks up at her and says, "Mom, are you on that drug today?" So I know that that's hard on a placebo study, but it's kind of lovely real world evidence. So I got interested, and then I got fascinated, and then other people got interested, and I gave a talk in Chicago, and my host came up afterwards and said, because I was, all psychedelics, a little bit on microdosing, and he said, "Wouldn't it be interesting if somebody just sent people a microdose, like a tabs with microdoses instead of a full dose on them, and a notebook and a pen, and asked them to make records?" And I said, "Yeah, that would be really interesting." He said, "I'll do that." And I thought, I don't know what you do, and I don't want to ask, and I'm not going to mention your name. So he did that, and we got these wonderful reports. One that I still recall vividly, and I don't know if that any of you will have this experience, but many people, when they return from Burning Man and come into this world, get depressed, because Burning Man has been so intense and so amazing and so whatever. And this lovely handwritten notebook comes back, and she said, "For the first time in all my times at Burning Man, I wasn't depressed when I got back. I was able to readjust to my normal life normally." So that really, so my interest keeps growing as I get more and more reports.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that unique in that it would be something boring that you'd want to pursue more, and then look what you find. It's also making me wonder, this protocol that is coined the Fadiman protocol, why that frequency? How did you come up with that? What do you make of that? Is it something that has to kind of build up over time for it to have the effect?
Like most of science, it isn't the way we'll report it later. The truth is, I was asking people, and I live part-time in Santa Cruz, California. It is easy to find people in Santa Cruz with psychedelic experience. Almost walk out on the street and yell, and you'll do fine. And so I said to some people I know, I'm interested in this. People are telling me that this very, very low dose is helpful. I was recommending that they might look at 10 micrograms of LSD, and they would all look at me like pointless. It's like having one swallow of beer when you want to get drunk. But they did it because they're psychonauts, and I began to get reports, and it expanded really from there. And the protocol was very early on. A lot of people said, it has a 2-day effect. Okay, so here is your baseline, and you say you're depressed, and you're less depressed on day 1, and you're less depressed on day 2. Well, day 3, you should be back at base. Now, if you're doing research, what you want is for people to be able to notice the difference between base and effect. So a 3-day protocol, which is 1 day on with taking a dose, 2nd day, the after effect is still with you. And then the 3rd day you're down, then the 4th day, you get a whole new kind of clinical or research cycle. So this was a research protocol. Now, it turns out after about a month of that, this is 9 or 10 cycles, people were reporting that the 3rd day was not that different from the other days, that they were now, their system had adjusted in some way, and whatever they were feeling, predominantly benefits, was fairly stable. So that's how the Fadiman protocol, as it's now called, got out there. It was absolutely not intended as a clinical protocol because we had no idea what was correct. We did know that with high-dose psychedelics, you can't take them consecutively because there's something called tolerance, which is your system just doesn't react. And we also know in high doses, there is what's called an afterglow of 4 to 6 weeks. If some of you have looked at the depression studies, for example, the high-dose depression studies, they say people don't get re-depressed for, and then they give you a number, 4, 6, 8 weeks, several months. A wonderful study recently said up to a year. But that's that afterglow. So microdoses seem to have a little bit of afterglow, and that's how we got the 3-day protocol. There are now other protocols. Again, the institute in the Netherlands, with the largest group of people they follow, has an every other day protocol for most people. Paul Stamets has a protocol which is 4 days on and 3 days off. He also has another protocol called 5 days on and 2 days off. And I said to Paul, which is it? He looked at me and he said, how about both? You just can't be too rigid. And I thought, this is the difference between the necessity for rigidity in formal science and the necessity for flexibility in the real world. So that's how it happened. And it's now, again, the large group of 4,000 people, it's the most popular protocol, followed probably by every other day and then the Stamets protocol. But they all seem to have similar effects as far as we can tell. That's a kind of subtlety that's very, very hard to tease out, particularly if you're in the group that says, well, there's probably no effect anyway, so there's nothing to distinguish. Okay?
Thank you. Yeah, time is just flying, and I think we're now at that time where we'd love to have audience questions. So please put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll ask you if you want to come up. And Danielle, we'll be hosting the Q&A.
Yeah, so I think we could start with Charlotte. Charlotte, you got a question?
Oh, yeah. So we had a question from one of our own team members. Sorry, let me pull it up. It was, excuse me while I find it. Okay. Sorry, I'm having a hard time finding it.
I think I could read it. So it says, I believe you on the website, the list of drugs that people report having used while adverse effects while taking the microdoses of psychedelics. Is there a threshold of number of people that report no side effects before you list a given drug? And what effort do you have to make to solicit reports on adverse effects?
It's very hard to get adverse effects, okay? The problem is that people that have adverse effects go away. That's really very simple, which is, if you look at a study and it says, well, look at the surveys, the kind of famous, there was no effect, where they started with 1,000 people who, they took them like 2 years to get enough people, 1,000 people who agreed to change envelopes, do a kind of tricky double blind on themselves, and fill out forms about psychological tests every few times during the study. That degenerated almost immediately to 191 people. Now, what happened to the other 800 people, we'll never know. Okay? So that's a problem with surveys. Surveys always favor the people who like whatever you're surveying. If you're doing a survey on, do I prefer high fat mayonnaise or low fat mayonnaise, the people who either don't care, which is a large percentage, or lose interest pretty quickly, they go away. Okay, so the people who, so surveys are inherently, the only surveys that I think make sense is one where you get people before they start. And so when people drop out, you can go after them and ask. Now, we had the opposite problem. At one point, we asked people to do a month because we found that people were willing to do a month. A lot of people dropped out before that. But we had a couple of people, and Sophia wrote me one day and she said, hey, we've got like 4 people who are over 100 days of reporting. What do you think we should do? I said, what do you think we should do? Smart. She said, well, I think we should ask them. Okay. So she wrote each one of them. And we got back, she reported to me that All four of them had serious conditions and were approaching death. Okay. So, but they found that microdosing was helpful. And the one that I remember the best was a young woman, college, because that's so depressing. And she indicated that she'd had a big fight with her parents over the possibility of microdosing, and they finally gave in. But they then reported that, yes, they now supported her. Her mood was up, her digestion was better, her cancer was not better. And she said, I hope that I will be able to keep this level of mood and complete another quarter of college before I die. Okay, so we do have some reports on long-term uses. We also have now some reports on people who have used it for years, but not with this kind of day-by-day precision. Because we also found with these long people, the other reason we're looking at them is people's moods generally went up and stayed up, but these people suddenly were all over the map. And what we found out is that their approaching death gave them some very horrible days, which they reported on their little mood scales. So.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you for sharing. We have another question by Kathleen. Kathleen, do you want to come up and ask the question?
Okay, yeah. Hi, Dr. Fadiman. Thank you so much for being here. Hi. Yeah, in a past interview, you had emphasized the essential importance of having a guide relationship between the person experiencing a psychedelic and someone more experienced than them to guide them. Can you elaborate on this? Is having a guide only important when people take a full dose of psychedelics, or is it unnecessary for people who microdose?
Great. Okay, that's a great question. Because I have an answer, probably that's why I like it, which is the reason you need a guide on a high dose is the same reason that when you're drunk, you don't drive. One of the reasons is a high dose is you don't function. What's the posture of someone on a high dose? Lying down with his mask and headphones, and now and then being helped if you need it. It's more like having a coach next to you than anything else. With a microdose, since you're in your normal day, you've gone to work, you've been to a sales meeting, you've talked to an irate customer, you almost got cut off in traffic, you found a place that sold flowers and you buy some for your beloved. It's a normal day. You don't need someone with you kind of holding your hand because you have not lost any function. In fact, we have a lot of evidence, again, mainly from college students, that they are physically not only fitter, but they are faster or stronger, or they're better in, these are mainly sports things where we have like some measurements. So they're functioning at a higher level. So they don't need a guide. There is a new occupation called Microdose Coaching. There's an international organization being formed. It's got 8 countries at the moment. And these are people who support or guide as necessary. And they help people maintain their goals and suggest that they journal. And they're also there just to be on hand if people get nervous or need help. For instance, someone who wants to use microdosing for something hard, like stopping drinking. Okay. There's a lot of times in early times of stopping drinking where you just want to say to someone, it's really hard, or I did a really good job. I went to a bar today and I didn't buy anything. I just said hello to friends. So there's a world of microdose coaching that has emerged. And those are very much not intense, but available, or checking in, every few days or once a week. But it's very different because physiologically, you're in a superior, for most people, situation. And therefore, last thing you need is someone, you can cross the street all by yourself.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Kathleen.
And now we can have Charlotte's question.
Yes. So I'm curious how you see a pathway to legalization if there aren't randomized controlled trials that show effect, and how you would design such a trial.
You mean you're asking me how to set up a decent trial for psychedelics? Well, we have we're kind of going to find out because Oregon is going to make psilocybin available for any reason, not medical, any reason as of January. And they're also going to have regulations for microdosing. So we're going to have, again, a lot of real world evidence coming in. And you have to understand that most of the FDA regulations have been very, very carefully designed and redesigned by the pharmaceutical companies. And they've been designed by the pharmaceutical companies so they can sell pharmaceuticals. And the government says, let's have more testing, and the pharmaceutical people say, let's have less. But it's about narrow casting for specific ailments. You may not know this, but you cannot suggest to the government that you would like to bring a pharmaceutical to market for more than one condition. Okay? So if you have something that's good for weight loss and it regrows hair, you have to make a decision to the government which you're going to go for and which you're going to allow everyone to do off-label. And now and then a pharmaceutical company gets sued for a few $1 million because they've hinted where the off-label market is. And I don't know the background, but if you look at Adderall, its off-market is with students is a huge percentage of its market. Okay, if we look at ketamine, ketamine is not allowed. The FDA has not approved ketamine for its use in the hundreds of ketamine clinics that are sprung up all over the country. So there's some difficulties in the system, and psychedelics don't fit the system very well. I mean, the problem for microdosing, for example, is what condition do you pick? And that's not correct ethically. See, and heaven forbid, there's a system called stacking, which is taking a microdose, and it turns out if you add a little bit of certain mushrooms like lion's mane and chaga, it works. It seems to work better. And that's according to research done by the Paul Stamets people. And also it shows up in that great big study of 4,000 people I mentioned. Well, you just can't go to the government and say, we have something that's harder than a single substance. And they say, well, we don't have a system. We're not equipped to deal with anything other than a single substance for a single use. So the problem is on both ends. And that's probably why citizen science has become so important, because it's the only way we get a certain kind of data. I mean, let me give you one. You're medical students, okay? Try this. This is a report. This is one case, okay? Now, one case, by the way, made headlines all over the world when it was a woman in San Francisco getting a bit of wiring into her brain for chronic depression. So an N of 1 is totally acceptable in the right settings if it's important. Okay, here's one. Diabetic. Same dose of insulin for 14 years. Stable condition. Microdoses. Within several weeks, she is taking 20% of her insulin. And again, stable, etc. Blood sugar correct, etc. Now, that's an interesting clinical question. And it's easy to design a study that would look at that, but that's the same substance. And I read you this lovely person with depression that we started with. So what do you see if we change? Let's make it not a medication. Let's make it not an FDA psychopharmaceutical. Let's call it a vitamin. See, no one says, well, what's the one use that vitamin D is for? Everyone looks at you and says, wait a moment, I thought you were a medical student. A vitamin affects the system. It improves functioning. Oh, okay. That's not the same as a medication that is narrow focused. So what I've found is in understanding the wide range for microdosing, it's easier to think of it as a vitamin, as a healthy supplement, rather than a focused medication. I hope that if it didn't answer it, I hope at least we worked on it a bit.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Fadiman. And we're about end of time. So thank you again for your talk and for answering this question.
Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to those of you who are not MDs becoming a wonderful group of MDs because you're in a wonderful school. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone for coming, and thank you for taking the time to come and speak with us.
Yes, thank you. I think we did work together on a lot of hard problems. So thanks for doing that with us. We had so much fun.
Serious questions, guys. Those are nice, difficult questions.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you soon.